I still remember how the air shifted in that house the day Owen and Haley moved in. It was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that sneaks in slowly like fog through a window left cracked. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just the sound of change that I needed to give it time. For almost 40 years, that house in Spokane held everything I knew about family. My husband and I built it with sweat and laughter. We raised Owen there. We planted apple trees in the back. Every dent in the kitchen counter had a story. Every picture on the wall had a memory. But once Haley came with her vision of modernity and calm neutrality, everything softened into something beige and unfamiliar. It started small. My old radio in the kitchen vanished one morning. She replaced it with some speaker that followed voice commands. She said it would help streamline the soundscape. I smiled even though I didn't understand what was wrong with my weathered old dial. Then my yellow floral curtains disappeared. She claimed the pattern was too loud for the open concept design she envisioned. I said nothing. I told myself this was the kind of compromise families made. Then came the room reshuffling. Haley asked if I could start keeping my things in the small back bedroom since the main guest suite would be better used as her home office. I obliged. She said it would be temporary. She always said things would be temporary. A few weeks later, she rearranged the furniture. My recliner was pushed into the garage. She replaced it with a new chair that, I'll be honest, looked like it had been built for someone who never wanted to sit long. It was all clean lines and cold fabric. She said the old chair clashed with the new aesthetic. I told myself none of it mattered, that a chair was just a chair. But one evening, while we were setting the table for dinner, Haley turned to Owen and said in her usual soft melodic voice that I had left water rings on the counter again. Then she glanced at me and added, not even trying to whisper, that maybe it was time I considered living in a space more aligned with my energy and needs. She said the kitchen was starting to feel cluttered. I stood there holding a bowl of mashed potatoes, not knowing whether to laugh or sit down. Owen didn't say anything. He just kept pouring the iced tea, eyes fixed on the pitcher like it held the answer to everything. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wallpaper I had picked out 23 years ago. The corners were starting to curl. I rubbed my thumb against one seam. It felt like something inside me was curling too. I think deep down, I already knew. I wasn't being included anymore. I was being erased. And still I said nothing. I woke up the next day, made my tea and baked the apple tart Owen always liked as a child. I even left it on the counter with a note saying he could take it to work. A part of me wanted to believe that somehow if I stayed gentle and generous, things would return to the way they were. But even that morning, I noticed Haley had hung a new sign in the kitchen. It said, "Less is more." Funny thing was, it didn't feel like there was less. It felt like everything familiar was being replaced by silence. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you've ever felt the quiet shift in your own home like you were being pushed out, one small decision at a time, then maybe you'll understand why I stayed. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I eventually didn't. This was only the beginning. By the second month, Haley began to act like the house had always belonged to her. She moved through it with a kind of quiet authority, as if she had rewritten the history of every room. I noticed the way she no longer asked before making changes. She simply did things. And if I noticed it was my problem, the pantry was the first real blow. I had arranged it the same way for decades. Top shelves for canned vegetables, lower ones for baking supplies. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. One morning I went to grab flour and everything was gone. Haley had rearranged it all into labeled glass jars and alphabetized spice racks. She called it optimizing. I called it erasing. Then she started making comments, small ones directed at no one but always with an edge. Things like the house smelled better when she used her diffuser, or it was so much easier to concentrate when there wasn't noise from the TV in the background. Of course, I was the one who watched the evening news. She never said it outright, but I felt it. I was the noise. One afternoon, I caught her scrubbing the windows with a white cloth. She didn't stop when I walked in. She just said lightly that fingerprints on glass made her feel anxious. I looked down and realized she was wiping away the smudges left from where I usually lean to water the plants. Little by little, she adjusted the temperature of the house, not just with the thermostat, but with every word, every look, every object she replaced. The air felt colder, not because of weather, but because I no longer knew where I belonged. One evening, as I stood by the back door brushing dirt from my gardening shoes, Haley called across the kitchen. She said she and Owen had been talking and thought it would be helpful if we came up with a few guidelines for shared spaces. She even had a printed list. Nothing dramatic, she said. Just a few ways to help everything run smoothly. She wanted the kitchen cleaned immediately after every use. No personal items left in the living room, no strong scents in shared spaces, no entry to the laundry room during her office hours. It was framed as a cooperative effort. But every item on that list was about me. I didn't argue. I nodded. I took the paper and thanked her. That night, I folded it and placed it in the drawer where I kept warranty manuals and expired coupons. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I didn't know why. But the worst moment came 2 weeks later on a Sunday. I had spent the morning trimming the front hedges. Gardening was still mine. Haley didn't like dirt under her nails, and for that I was grateful. I came inside sweaty and sun-touched, craving iced tea. I heard voices from the kitchen and paused. Haley was speaking in that tone she used when she wanted to sound thoughtful but was actually delivering a verdict. She told Owen she needed space to feel truly settled, that having someone constantly occupying the house limited their sense of growth. Then she added something that made my legs go cold. She said this no longer feels like our home. It feels like we're guests in someone else's memory. Owen didn't correct her. He didn't remind her whose name was on the deed. He didn't say my name at all. He just said he understood. Then silence. I backed away, careful not to make a sound. I went to my room and closed the door. That night I lay awake for hours. I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time Owen and I had laughed together. Tried to remember the last time he asked how I was doing. I couldn't. I realized something then. Haley wasn't just trying to reshape the house. She was reshaping the narrative, turning it into a place where I was just a temporary piece, a shadow, a burden dressed as history. And Owen, my only son, was letting it happen. I didn't cry, I didn't confront anyone, but I started keeping my most important papers in a bag beside my bed. The deed, my husband's will, my savings log, and one small envelope labeled originals. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I knew it was no longer safe to assume I'd be asked. It happened on a Thursday morning, just after 8 o'clock. I had finished folding laundry and was walking back from the dryer when I heard Haley on the phone in the hallway. Her voice was clipped and tight. She was pacing. I stopped before turning the corner, waiting for her to pass. She said we need to move things forward before she changes her mind. Then a pause. Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. No, she doesn't know. She still thinks the account's in her name. I stood still, not moving. My fingers tightened around the laundry basket. She turned the corner and saw me standing there. For a second, she froze. Then she smiled, wide and artificial, like nothing had just happened. She asked if I needed help with the towels. I told her no, I had it. That afternoon, I went to my room and opened the folder I had tucked away beside the bed. Inside were copies of everything I still had access to. The deed to the house, the will my husband left before he passed, my bank statements. One of the accounts had changed routing numbers I hadn't noticed before. Now I did. I called the bank. I said I wanted to confirm the account details on file. The woman on the phone was polite, but her tone shifted when I mentioned the account name. She asked for verification. I gave her everything she needed. She paused again and said, I'm sorry, but this account was closed last month. It's been consolidated into a new trust. Name on file is Rollins Family Holding. I didn't say a word. I ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the beige carpet. I felt like the floor had tilted under me, only slightly, but enough to make everything off balance. That evening, I didn't join them for dinner. I made soup in the microwave, ate it in my room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I kept listening for footsteps, a voice, anything to tell me I was still part of something. The next day, Owen left for work early. Haley was in the living room when I came out to make tea. She looked up and said she had a favor to ask. She wanted to have a few friends over that weekend, just for a light brunch. She said it would be easier if I stayed with my friend Joanne for a couple days. So it would be less crowded, she added. Her voice stayed calm, like she was asking me to pick up milk from the store. I said no, I had plans. She tilted her head and gave me a tight smile, then went back to her laptop without another word. 2 hours later, I went out to trim the roses. When I came back, the door was locked. I tried the handle, then rang the bell. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I walked around to the back. The sliding door was locked too. My key didn't work. I stood there for a minute, holding my gloves in one hand, staring at my own reflection in the glass. I could hear faint music inside. Someone had turned up the volume. Eventually, Owen opened the front door. He looked tired. He said Haley had changed the locks, that it wasn't personal, just space, just until things settled down. I asked where I was supposed to go. He didn't answer, just said I could use the guest house at Joanne's or find something short-term. I didn't cry. I walked down the driveway with my gardening gloves still in hand and got in my car. I drove 3 blocks before pulling over. My chest was tight, not from sadness, not yet, from disbelief, from something deeper, like being erased in real time. I ended up at a small extended stay motel on Route 6. It wasn't much. The carpet had a smell of old lemon cleaner and the walls were thin, but there was a window and the lock worked, and for the first time in months, I could hear myself breathe. That night, I didn't sleep. I opened the folder again, laid out every document I had, and began to circle inconsistencies, routing numbers, dates, signatures. Something was wrong, something more than disrespect, something criminal. I remembered what Haley said on the phone. We need to move things forward before she changes her mind. She didn't think I'd notice. She didn't think I'd act. She thought, because I stayed quiet for so long, I'd stay quiet forever. That weekend, I called Trina. She was my old friend's daughter, now a lawyer working in elder rights. I didn't explain much over the phone. I just asked if she could come by. I said I needed to show her something. She arrived Sunday morning with a canvas bag and a notepad. She listened, said almost nothing, just nodded as I walked her through every detail. When I finished, she sat back and exhaled. Then she said one sentence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan. And I realized everything I had been feeling wasn't just in my head. It was real. Every silence, every nudge, every smile with a sharp edge. They weren't waiting for me to leave. They were making sure I couldn't come back. Trina returned the next morning with 2 large binders, a legal pad, and an expression that told me she hadn't slept much either. She sat across from me at the motel's tiny round table and started flipping pages without ceremony. She had already pulled the deed records from the county clerk's office. The original documents from 25 years ago showed my husband and me listed as co-owners, but the updated record, filed just 6 weeks ago, listed the property as part of the Rollins Family Holding Trust. The signature on the transfer was shaky, inconsistent with mine. I had never seen that document before. Trina pointed to the notary stamp. It was from a woman named Doreen Tillman. Trina already had her address and said she would be stopping by to confirm the authentication in person, but her voice had a weight to it. Like she already knew what she'd find. She believed the signature was forged. I believed it too. Next came the financial records. I had suspected for weeks that something was off, but now it was clear. Trina had traced movement between my checking account and a new private trust Owen had opened under a business-sounding name. Quiet, meticulous transfers over 6 months, each just under the reporting threshold. It was smart. It was deliberate. And it was theft. I felt my stomach tighten, not from surprise, but from confirmation. It was worse to know for sure than to wonder. My own son, not only letting it happen, but orchestrating it with the woman he married. Trina paused and looked me in the eyes. She said, "If we moved forward, things would get messy, not violent, but personal." She said Haley was the kind of woman who'd turn narrative into ammunition. She'd cry in public, twist timelines, say I was confused or unstable. Trina had seen it before. I said I didn't care about their side of the story anymore. I only cared about the truth and my name and what was rightfully mine. That afternoon, we drafted a letter of inquiry to the trust's managing firm. It was formal and direct. Trina would send it under her letterhead with a deadline for response. She said it was the first domino. Once it fell, everything would have to move. Paper trails couldn't hide what had already been done. I spent the next 2 days sorting through boxes I had brought from the garage long ago. Old receipts, birthday cards, insurance claims, small moments I had once thought unimportant. But one page caught my attention. A handwritten ledger from my husband dated before his final surgery. It listed household assets, projected savings, and one note at the bottom. "If anything happens to me, Sybil keeps the house, non-negotiable." It wasn't notarized, it wasn't legal in itself, but it was him. His words, his handwriting, and his intention. I slid it into a plastic sleeve and added it to Trina's folder. On the third morning, Trina called me just after sunrise. She sounded sharper, alert. The notary admitted the signature wasn't done in her presence. She remembered Haley bringing the document in and saying I had signed it privately. Doreen had hesitated but filed it anyway, assuming it was legitimate. That was enough. By noon, Trina had filed for an emergency injunction. It wouldn't reverse the trust, but it would block any further changes until the court could review the case. It gave us time. It froze the damage, and it put Haley and Owen on notice. Late that night, I got a message, a short one from Owen. He said he wanted to talk, that things had gone too far, that maybe we should meet. No apology, no explanation, just a request to talk. I didn't respond. The next morning, I walked to the corner coffee near the motel. I ordered a plain coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street. I felt hollow, but not weak, just quiet. Trina arrived an hour later with another folder. This one had copies of every document we were submitting to the court. She laid them out one by one, her voice low and steady. Each page represented a brick in the wall I was rebuilding around myself. I asked what would happen next. She said we'd wait for the court to process the injunction, then prepare for a full hearing. She warned that Owen might try to play innocent, say he hadn't known, that Haley might deny forging anything, but she had built stronger cases with less. She looked at me carefully and said something I haven't forgotten. "You didn't wait too long. You waited exactly long enough to know who they really were." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood something deeper. Sometimes the people we raise become strangers, and sometimes strangers wear the face of someone we once cradled in our arms. That night, I opened my motel window and let the night air in. It smelled like dust and pine. I sat on the edge of the bed, not crying, not shaking, just still. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not because the fight was over, but because I had finally begun it. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. In that stretch of quiet, something inside me began to shift. Not quickly, not dramatically, but like sediment settling in clear water. I was still staying at the motel, still sipping coffee by the same window each morning. But now there was a calm in the routine. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was preparing. Trina spent the next few days lining up documents, witness statements, and expert opinions. She moved with a rhythm that felt surgical. She didn't fill the space with unnecessary words. She just worked. And I matched her pace even when it meant revisiting things I would rather forget. One morning, we went to the clerk's office again, this time to get copies of a separate document I hadn't thought to check before. A line item in one of my old tax returns showed a co-owned asset I'd long forgotten. A small rental cabin on the edge of a state park, one my husband and I had bought before Owen was born. I had assumed it was sold. Turns out it was transferred silently into the same Rawlings family holding trust. Same forged signature. Same pattern. That evening, Trina brought over something new. Surveillance footage from a convenience store ATM. It showed Owen withdrawing cash from the private trust account, which he had claimed in a previous statement was managed only by Haley. The timestamp matched one of the withdrawals we had flagged. It wasn't just implication now. It was evidence. I stared at the image of my son on the screen. Gray hoodie, eyes down, hand moving with practiced ease. I couldn't decide what hurt more, seeing him lie or seeing how easy it had become for him. Trina placed a hand on the table and told me we had enough. Not just for the injunction to hold, but for the trust to be revoked. With this evidence, the court could declare the transfer void and restore the title to me, but it came with a warning. If we moved forward, Owen and Haley would no longer be able to backpedal. This would be war in paper and public. I gave her a single nod. Quiet. Firm. 2 days before the hearing, I drove back to the house, not to knock, not to reclaim anything but to see it one more time before the story moved forward. The roses in the front yard had overgrown, the porch light was out, and through the window, I saw someone I think Haley moving boxes into the den. She didn't see me. I didn't wait to be noticed. I drove away with a silence I hadn't known I was capable of. That night, Trina and I stayed late preparing my testimony. She coached me on tone, reminded me to stay grounded in facts, not emotion. But I already knew. I wasn't there to accuse. I was there to reclaim. On the morning of the hearing, I wore the same pale blue blouse I had worn to my husband's retirement party. It was the last time our family had felt intact. I stood in the mirror for a long time before leaving, not out of vanity, but to steady myself. I didn't want pity. I wanted presence. The courtroom was modest, wooden benches, a single row of windows that let in sharp morning light. Haley sat across the room with her lawyer all-pressed blouse and tight jaw. Owen arrived 5 minutes later. He looked tired. Thinner, almost smaller than I remembered. He didn't look at me once. When the judge entered, the room tightened. Trina stood first. She spoke with control but never coldness. She walked through the facts like threads in a pattern, building the picture slowly, deliberately. She presented the documents, the signatures, the tax filings, the video stills. She read aloud the line from my husband's handwritten note. If anything happens to me, Sybil keeps the house. Non-negotiable. Haley's lawyer objected to the note, called it sentimental noise. The judge allowed it anyway, noting its consistency with previous filings. When it was my turn to speak, I rose without shaking. I told them I had spent my life building a home. Not just the house, but a space of safety. I had given my time, my money, and my name. I had trusted my son and I had been erased. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry. I simply described what had happened as plainly as the papers we had filed. The judge listened carefully. He asked questions not to me, but to the attorneys. He flipped through documents, underlined sections, tapped the edge of his pen. At the end of the session, he did not make a final ruling, but he granted an extension of the injunction and set a follow-up hearing with instructions for forensic review of all signatures involved. That alone was a signal. He didn't believe the documents were clean. Outside the courtroom, Owen walked by me without a word. Haley looked over her shoulder once, but kept walking. I watched them go, not with anger, but with a stillness that surprised me. Something was crumbling behind their eyes, something they couldn't control anymore. Trina joined me at the top of the courthouse steps. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. We both knew what had just happened. The lie had lost its footing and the truth was gaining ground. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I hadn't slept much. But it wasn't nerves that kept me up. It was the quiet realization that something fundamental between Owen and me had been severed. Not in anger, but in clarity. It wasn't just that he had lied or let Haley take over. It was that he had let my presence become optional, a burden. And somehow that had given him permission to erase me. Trina called just after 8 o'clock and said the forensic handwriting expert had already submitted a preliminary report. I met her at her office and she handed me the printed results. The expert confirmed what we had suspected. The signature on the deed transfer wasn't mine. The slant, the pressure, the flow of the pen, it was someone trying to imitate my hand, but not well enough. We now had documented proof of forgery paired with the notary's written statement and Owen's own bank activity. Legally, it was tightening. Emotionally, it was unraveling. The court set the next hearing for 10 days later. During that time, Trina advised me to keep quiet and let things build, but it wasn't silence I struggled with. It was the in-between. The long hours between discovery and decision where nothing changes on the surface, but everything breaks apart underneath. On the 5th day, I received a letter. No return address, just my name in thick black pen. Inside was a single page typed. It read, "This didn't have to be public. You could have talked to us. You made your choice. Don't expect sympathy." No signature, but I recognized the tone. Haley, cold, calculated, always posturing strength, always flipping blame. I didn't show it to Trina. I didn't keep it either. I dropped it straight into the motel room trash, then walked outside for air. Across the street, a woman was gardening outside her small rental unit. She waved politely and I nodded back. The normalcy of her movement struck me, bending to trim basil, moving pots slightly for more light. As if the world hadn't shifted for her like it had for me, and I envied that. Later that night, I opened the storage bin I had hauled from my garage before I was locked out. Inside were old receipts, a stack of recipe books, and one faded envelope from my mother. I had forgotten I'd saved it. Inside was a small card and a folded check she had written me years ago. Not for a large amount, but with a note. For when things feel too far gone, you're not. I closed the bin and sat there for a long time. Not sad, not even tired, just held by the quiet weight of everything I had once carried. And everything I had to let go. The next morning, Trina arrived with new documents. She had spoken to the estate attorney who managed the previous draft of my husband's will. He agreed to submit a sworn affidavit. In it, he confirmed that my husband had spoken clearly more than once about ensuring I retained ownership of the house, and that Owen and Haley were only to benefit if I chose to allow it. This statement wouldn't reverse the trust by itself, but it painted a picture, one the court was starting to see. As we organized files on the motel bedspread, Trina turned to me and asked something unexpected. She wanted to know what I planned to do if the court ruled in my favor. Keep the house? Sell it? Move back in? I didn't have an answer ready. For a long time, all I had wanted was to be seen, to not be erased. But now, I wasn't sure that reclaiming the house meant reclaiming peace. The walls held too many echoes, and maybe the real healing wasn't inside them anymore. I told her I'd think about it, and I meant it. The following day, we received the judge's interim ruling. The court agreed there was sufficient evidence of forgery and financial misconduct. He ordered a freeze on all assets connected to the Rawlings family trust until a formal trial. That meant Haley and Owen couldn't move money, sell property, or make any changes without court approval. It wasn't final, but it was firm, a signal that their grip had slipped. I stood at the window of the motel room after Trina left, watching the streetlights blink on one by one. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped. I felt still, Like the moment just before the tide turns. A small thought entered my mind and lingered. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want an apology. I wanted something harder to describe. I wanted to know I could walk forward without bending, that I could breathe without shrinking, that the next chapter of my life would not be written by anyone else's pen. That night, I wrote in a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Just one line. You don't have to win everything. You just have to stop handing yourself away. And with that, I closed the book and turned out the light. By the time the second hearing approached, the motel room had started to feel less like a temporary stop and more like a quiet waiting room before the rest of my life. I didn't decorate. I didn't unpack fully. But I knew every creak of the window frame, every shadow cast by the parking lot light outside. And in that small space, I had begun to feel steadier. Not happy, but less breakable. The night before court, I sat with Trina going over our final statements. She was calm as always, but there was a subtle charge beneath her words. She knew how hard Owen and Haley had fought back over the past week. They had hired another lawyer, filed a motion to dismiss the forgery claim, sent a counterclaim suggesting I was mentally unfit. All of it desperate. None of it working. Trina said it plainly. They're cornered and they're scrambling. But I wasn't interested in punishing them. I just wanted the line redrawn, the one they had crossed when they decided my trust was something to manipulate. When Haley treated my name like a detail to be forged, when Owen stood by and let it all happen, that morning, I walked into the courthouse not with a sense of dread, but with a strange calm. I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to Owen's graduation. I remembered how proud I had been of him that day, how I clapped the loudest when they called his name. And now, I walked into a courtroom to prove that had sold me out. Haley sat stiff in her chair, lips pressed so tight they were barely visible. Her lawyer whispered to her constantly, flipping through folders as if sheer paperwork could undo what was coming. Owen wasn't there. He had sent a statement instead. Trina handed me a copy. In it, he called me confused. He said I had misunderstood his intentions, that Haley had only stepped in to protect the family assets, that I was too emotional to manage the estate after Dad died, and that he regretted the situation. Not the choices. Just the situation. The judge opened with a summary. He noted the forged documents, the frozen assets, the sworn affidavits. He acknowledged the new motion filed by Haley's team, but made it clear that it did not carry enough legal ground to dismiss the case. Then he gave Trina the floor. She didn't rush. She built the case like a staircase. One fact, one moment, one truth at a time. She reminded the court that this was not a case of misunderstanding. It was a case of calculated erasure, that my signature was taken, that my rights were transferred, that everything I had built with my husband was absorbed into something I had never agreed to. She ended by reading aloud my husband's handwritten promise, not a formal will, but a note he had left tucked into the back of a shared cookbook. Make sure Sybil has the house. It's hers. It always was. When it was Haley's turn, her lawyer changed tone. Gone was the defensiveness. Instead, he painted a picture of concern, that Haley had only acted to protect me, that the financial decisions were meant to stabilize the estate, that the trust was created out of love. But they had no answer for the forged signature. The judge asked Haley directly who had signed the deed. Her lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Haley shifted in her chair, voice thin, and said she had assumed Owen handled it. She didn't know the details. She wasn't sure. It was the first time I saw her unsure of anything. The judge didn't respond right away. He simply leaned back, adjusted his glasses, and asked for a 10-minute recess. During that time, Trina and I sat in silence. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. When court resumed, the judge delivered his ruling. He declared the deed transfer invalid due to forgery. The trust was to be dissolved, and the house returned to my sole ownership. He ordered a formal investigation into the handling of the estate, including Owen's withdrawals. And he issued a protective clause that required both Haley and Owen to seek court approval before making any legal or financial changes involving me in the future. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was justice. Outside the courtroom, I stepped into the sun and felt something leave me. Not sadness, not anger, just weight. A kind of heaviness I had carried for too long without knowing it. Trina stood beside me holding a new folder in her arms. She said we'd need to follow up on the financial audits next. I nodded. But for now, I just wanted to walk, to move forward with my own feet, not pushed, not dragged. We walked down the courthouse steps slowly. I didn't look back. That evening, I sat on the motel bed staring at the ceiling. I thought about the years that had led to this, the birthdays I had baked for, the bills I had paid, the quiet moments when I forgave things I shouldn't have. And I thought about how long it had taken me to see that being quiet wasn't the same as being respected. I didn't cry, I didn't smile either. But I slept. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't dream of the house. I dreamed of something new, something still unnamed, but it was mine. I moved back into the house 3 days after the ruling. I expected it to feel triumphant, maybe even comforting. But as I stood in the entryway, my key trembling in the lock for the first time in months, I was struck by something colder. It didn't feel like mine. The walls were still painted the soft sage color I'd chosen with Henry. The sun still filtered through the front windows the way it used to in the early morning's things. But the air had shifted. It smelled like absence, like a place that had forgotten who belonged to it. The furniture had been rearranged. Haley's signature was everywhere. Brass knobs on my kitchen cabinets, a new light fixture that hung too low in the hallway, photographs that didn't include me. On the hallway shelf, there was a family portrait taken recently, and someone had clipped the image to crop me out entirely. My face had once been next to Owen's. Now, there was a flower vase in its place. I didn't take it down. I didn't move anything. Not yet. That first night, I didn't sleep in my old bedroom. I couldn't. I made up the guest room bed using the faded quilt I had sewn with Henry decades ago. In a quiet way, it helped. It reminded me of simpler beginnings. The next morning, I walked the house slowly, room by room. I didn't make lists or notes, I just observed. I let myself feel everything without judgment. The quiet was louder here. It echoed. I wondered if they ever noticed how cold the place got in the afternoons when the shadows stretched across the floor. In the living room, I found a shoebox tucked into the corner of the bookshelf. Inside were envelopes, bank notices, cashier's loan documents, and something else. A printed copy of a life insurance policy. I read it twice. It listed Owen as the sole beneficiary of my policy, a policy I hadn't touched in over a decade. But the update was recent. Too recent. Haley's handwriting was faint on one corner of the envelope, just a note with numbers. When I called Trina, her voice tightened. She asked me to send photos of the documents immediately, and then she asked a single question. "Did you sign any amendments to your policy in the last 12 months?" I told her no. She didn't need to say anything else. I already knew where this was going. Later that day, I received a voicemail from Owen. His voice was calm, rehearsed. He said he was sorry for how things unfolded, that he hoped we could one day understand each other again. And then, in a pause, he added that it was unfair to put the house above family harmony. I didn't call back. That evening, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Owen used to do his homework, where Henry used to spread the newspaper, where I used to sit alone and wonder when everything started to shift. I had spent months fighting to return to this house, and now I realized I didn't need to stay. The victory wasn't the walls. It wasn't the deed in my name. It was the fact that I had said no, that I had stepped forward when they wanted me silent, that I had stopped apologizing for existing. The next day, I called Trina and asked her to meet me at the courthouse. I told her I needed to make some changes. When we sat in the office with the clerk, I handed over 2 documents. The first was a revocation of Owen's power of attorney. I had granted it years ago before I understood how power could be misused in silence. The second was a new trust document. It removed Owen and Haley entirely from the estate. Instead, I named a local foundation as successor trustee, one that provided education and legal aid for older women displaced from their homes. Trina looked at me, surprised but not questioning. I told her I didn't want revenge. I wanted redefinition. I wanted this house and everything it represented to mean something better than what they had tried to make it. Back at the house, I began packing. Not because I was forced to, but because I had chosen to. I called a moving service to help sort the furniture. I didn't want the brass handles. I didn't need the fake crystal chandelier. I wanted the old rocking chair from the sunroom, the bird feeder from the back porch, the photo of Henry holding Owen when he was just a baby, still full of wonder. In the backyard, I watched the leaves rustle in the wind. The light hit the corner of the porch just right. For a moment, I stood there with my tea, letting the silence wrap around me like an old shawl. I had fought for this space, and now I was letting it go on my own terms. That was the twist I never saw coming. It wasn't about getting everything back. It was about becoming someone who no longer had to. The dinner invitation came in a thick cream envelope, hand-delivered to my mailbox. No return address. No explanation. Just a short note at the bottom in Haley's looping handwriting. It said, "Let's talk like family." It would have been easy to toss it aside, ignore it, but something in the timing told me not to. Maybe it was the curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet sense that this wasn't just a meal. I wore black slacks, a pale blouse, no jewelry. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look like I meant business. Trina had offered to accompany me, but I told her no. This I needed to face on my own. They rented out a private room at one of those trendy new places downtown. All marble countertops and cold metal fixtures, the kind of place that served $12 kale salad and called it artisan. When I walked in, Owen stood up. Haley didn't. She barely looked up from her water glass. The room smelled of tension and lemon vinaigrette. Owen gestured toward the chair across from him. I sat. A waiter approached and asked about wine. I declined. We went through the motions at first. "How have you been? The weather's been strange." I let them speak. I waited. Finally, Haley folded her hands, her nails immaculate, her tone rehearsed. She said they had talked and decided that maybe it was time to find a way forward. That we were still family after all, that the courts didn't need to define our relationship. Then came the real part. She said they were in the process of refinancing the house, that it would be easier, cleaner, if I would agree to transfer the deed to them formally. In exchange, she added, they would consider adding my name to a shared investment account, one that Owen had started with what was left of her Henry's original retirement fund. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch. I let them hear it. Not the silence of defeat, but the kind that fills a room when someone realizes they've misjudged the other person entirely. When I finally looked at Haley, I smiled, not out of warmth, out of clarity. I told them the house had already been placed in a trust, a new one they weren't a part of. That the deed no longer served their ambitions. Haley blinked once, then again. Her lips parted, but no sound followed. I added that the investment account she mentioned had already been reviewed by my legal counsel, and that the funds Owen used were improperly withdrawn under expired power of attorney. Owen's face drained of color. His fork clinked against his plate. I stood up then. The dinner wasn't over, but my part in it was. On my way out, I paused by the door. Looked back just long enough to say one more thing. I told them not to contact me further unless it was through Trina's office. And then I walked out into the cool night air, letting the door shut behind me with finality. The next morning, I received an email from Trina. She had been contacted by Haley's attorney. They were now requesting a meeting, not with me, with her, which meant they had finally understood the shift in power. I went for a walk after that, around the lake where I used to take Owen when he was little. The ducks were still there, the same odd ripple patterns on the surface. I thought about the way time moves, how some things look still, but underneath the surface, they're changing constantly. That afternoon, I packed the last of my things, the ones I had stored away after moving out months before. Not because I was leaving again, but because I was letting go of the past version of the house that used to define me. I boxed up Owen's childhood drawings, the ones he never asked to take. I folded the old tablecloth from Henry's retirement party. I slipped the worn photograph of all three of us into a drawer. It no longer needed to sit out. That night, I made dinner for one. Pasta with roasted vegetables, a glass of iced tea. The kitchen was quiet, but it felt peaceful now, like I had finally cleared the echo. Before going to bed, I lit a small candle in the living room, not for tradition, not for sentiment, just for the soft flicker it cast on the walls. The house no longer held power over me. Neither did Owen or Haley. Not because they had changed, but because I had. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to understand. I had reclaimed more than a home. I had reclaimed myself. The letter came 2 days later, folded twice in a plain envelope, postmarked from within Spokane, but with no name on the front, just my address and neat, blocky handwriting I recognized instantly. It was from Owen. The handwriting hadn't changed since he was in middle school, when he used to leave notes on the fridge reminding me of soccer practice or asking for lunch money. But this wasn't one of those notes. It was short. He wrote that he was sorry for how things had turned out, that he had gotten swept up, that he hoped I would consider reopening a line of communication. There was no mention of Haley, no questions, no warmth, just a simple request to meet somewhere neutral. A diner we used to go to when he was a boy. I set the letter down on the table and stared at it, not out of anger, not even disappointment anymore. I was just still, like something inside me had been holding its breath and now wasn't sure whether to exhale. That night, I didn't sleep much. I made tea. I cleaned the grout in the bathroom, even though it didn't need it. I reread the letter a dozen times and placed it in the drawer beside Henry's old wristwatch. In the morning, I called Trina. Her voice was steady, as always. She said it was my decision, that if I wanted to meet him, she would support it, but that I should walk in with my eyes open. I agreed to meet him 3 days later. The diner was just the same. Red leather booths, too much chrome, a faint scent of syrup baked into the walls. I arrived early and chose a seat by the window. Owen walked in 10 minutes late. He looked older than I remembered, tired, maybe even smaller. He didn't try to hug me, just sat across from me and ordered coffee. He spoke slowly at first, said he'd been thinking a lot, that when I moved out, he expected to feel relief, that things would quiet down, settle into the version of life Haley had laid out for them. But instead, the house felt wrong, still cold, even when the heater ran. He admitted he hadn't checked the trust papers until recently, that he hadn't even known the exact numbers until the meeting with Trina, that Haley had told him not to worry about the details. His eyes looked down when he mentioned her. I asked if they were still together. He said nothing at first, then nodded barely. He said she had changed, that she spent more time at work now, that when they spoke, it was all about logistics, money, upgrades. He said he wasn't sure how they got to that place. I didn't tell him that I knew exactly how they did. I didn't need to. Instead, I asked about the last real moment he remembered feeling like himself. He said it was the night we made cinnamon rolls during a snowstorm when he was 9. The power had gone out and we lit candles and told stories until the dough rose. He smiled when he said it, A small, real smile, not the kind he wore at their parties. We sat in silence for a while. When the check came, I reached for it. He stopped me, paid in cash. On the way out, he looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the wind toss the trees back and forth. I didn't know what to make of the conversation. It wasn't an apology, not really, and it didn't change what had happened. But it reminded me that there was still a small flicker inside him, a piece that remembered warmth, that remembered cinnamon rolls in the dark. I wasn't sure if that piece would grow or fade. I didn't plan on finding out. The next day, I finalized the paperwork with Trina. The trust was now structured as irrevocable. The house, the 2 additional properties I had quietly purchased, and the investment dividends from Henry's old portfolio would be tied into a charitable foundation, one focused on transitional housing for women over 60 who had been displaced or overlooked by their families. Trina told me it was one of the most purposeful uses of legacy she had ever seen. I told her it wasn't legacy. It was justice in a quieter form. I didn't need Owen to know the details. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted someone out there to feel seen when they thought no one noticed anymore. Later that evening, I pulled out an old recipe card from the kitchen drawer. The cinnamon rolls. The ink was faded, corners stained with butter and years. I baked them, just once more. The house smelled like memory, but this time it didn't ache. It just filled the room and made it warm. I sat by the window, a fresh roll in my hand, and felt the quiet settle in, not as something empty, but something earned. The following weeks passed in a soft hush, not quiet from loneliness, but from a calm I hadn't felt in years. My mornings started early, just before the sky warmed. I would sit on the porch with coffee, wrapped in the same blue shawl Henry gave me one Christmas long ago, and watch the sun climb over the rooflines. I had moved into a small cottage that overlooked a narrow stretch of forest just west of Spokane. It wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, but it was mine. No shared walls, no surveillance glances, no one tiptoeing around my presence or whispering about the thermostat. Trina helped me close on the property in full. Everything was under my name, free and clear. She insisted on sending me updates about the progress of the foundation. We were 3 months in, and already 2 women had been placed in emergency transitional units through the housing program. One of them, Margaret, sent a handwritten note thanking the organization for giving her a space with a locking door. I read that letter over dinner and let the silence around me absorb it, not out of pride, but from something more still, something like purpose. Haley tried contacting me once. It was an email, short, polished, like a press release. She said she had become aware of the change in the trust, that she had been advised to speak directly with me. She used the phrase, revisit arrangements. I didn't answer. A week later, Owen called. This time, he didn't open with pleasantries. His voice was rough. He said he knew about the foundation, that he had seen the articles and the photos online, that some of his coworkers had even shared the story, not realizing he was the Owen Rollins from the feature. He said people were praising my strength, that they called it admirable, even noble. He paused, then said quietly that he finally understood why I didn't come back. I said nothing. There was nothing more to explain. Instead, I spent the next morning with Trina reviewing the next stage of the foundation. We planned to expand. A second property had been identified, an old motel on the edge of town. It needed work, but the bones were strong. She said the potential was there, with the right hands. It could become a safe space for a dozen more women. That night, I sat with my journal and wrote one sentence. I am no longer a guest in my own life. It was strange to see it in ink, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. I no longer looked over my shoulder in my own home. I no longer waited for a knock or a raised voice or a subtle shift in temperature that meant I had overstayed my welcome. I breathed without apology now. Some nights I would open the kitchen window and listen to the wind, and I'd think of that moment in the diner when Owen smiled at the memory of cinnamon rolls. It was a flicker, yes, but flickers were how fires began. Whether or not he chose to let it burn was no longer mine to carry. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight lift. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't justice exactly, it was release, and that was more than enough. It was nearly spring when I stood in the threshold of the old motel for the first time. The air still held a bite, but light lingered longer each evening, as if the season itself had decided not to give up. The building was tired, shutters hung crooked, the roof wore decades of rain, and the paint on the siding had peeled into curling strips. But I didn't see decay. I saw space. Space that could become sanctuary. Trina stood beside me, clipboard in hand, already coordinating the inspection team. I watched her talk, watched her hands move like someone used to making things happen. She had always been sharp, but now she carried something else, a kind of quiet fire. I liked knowing part of it had come from this journey we walked together. When we turned the key and stepped inside, the smell of dust and old air hit first. But beneath it, I caught something else. Possibility. We walked through the rooms, the narrow halls. Each had potential. A kitchenette here, a bunk there. One suite had enough space for a communal gathering area. I imagined couches, warm lamps, a bookshelf filled with paperbacks left by strangers. In the far corner room, there was a window facing the mountains. I stopped there for a moment and breathed it in. This, I thought, this would be the room they could rest in. The room where silence would mean safety, not exile. By the end of that month, renovations began. Donations had come in faster than expected, helped along by a piece in the local newspaper and a segment on a regional broadcast. They called it the Rollins House. I hadn't asked for that, but I let it be. I never returned to the old house. Haley and Owen had moved, I heard. Something about a transfer, a fresh start. I didn't chase the details. One afternoon, I received a letter. It was short, no return address. But I knew the handwriting. It said, "I think I see things more clearly now. I'm sorry for how it ended. I hope you're doing well." I read it once, then folded it and placed it in the back of my drawer. Not out of anger, not out of forgiveness either. Just acknowledgement. Some wounds don't need to be dressed every day. They just need to be left alone long enough to fade. The following week, a woman named Gloria moved into the new transitional suite. She was quiet, always carrying a red thermos and a paperback tucked into her coat. One evening, I passed her in the garden we were planting behind the main office. She looked up and said it felt good to be somewhere. Nobody asked her to shrink. I nodded and told her that space was built for women like her and like me. Later that night, as I sat by the window in my own home, I thought about how far I had come. I had once feared being left out of a house. Now I was building them, not for validation, for restoration. For a long time, I thought strength meant staying patient, staying quiet, staying loyal. But sometimes strength means walking away and deciding that the life ahead matters more than the comfort of the known. So I did. And in doing so, I found something I never expected. Not peace. That came later. But dignity, and from that, everything else followed. If this story reminded you of a time you had to reclaim your own worth, know that you're not alone. Many of us spend years waiting to be chosen, to be respected, to be seen. Sometimes choosing yourself is the first real act of healing. If this resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts below or simply sit with it in silence. Your story matters too.